The old house on Elm Street had been abandoned for decades, its windows shattered, its walls covered in creeping ivy. The townsfolk whispered about it, calling it the Hollow House. They said it was cursed, that anyone who entered never came out the same, if they came out at all. But to 17-year-old Mia, it was just another dare. A way to prove she wasn't afraid of anything. The night was cold, the moon a pale sliver in the sky, as Mia and her friends approached the house. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. The front door creaked open with a push, revealing a darkness so thick it felt alive. Mia stepped inside, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. The walls were stained, the floorboards warped and splintered. Her friends followed, their laughter nervous, echoing through the empty halls. They split up, as they always did in these games. Mia wandered alone, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust. She found herself in a room at the end of the hall, its walls covered in strange symbols, crude, jagged lines that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. In the center of the room was a chair, its wood blackened and cracked. Something about it made her skin crawl. She turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind her. The air grew colder, her breath visible in the beam of her flashlight. The symbols on the walls began to glow, a sickly green light that filled the room. Mia's heart pounded as she heard a voice, low and guttural, whispering words she couldn't understand. The chair began to shake, the wood splintering as something emerged from it, a figure, hunched and twisted, its skin pale and stretched too tight over its bones. Mia screamed, but no sound came out. The figure turned to her, its eyes black voids, its mouth a jagged slit filled with broken teeth. It reached for her, its fingers long and clawed. She stumbled back, her flashlight falling to the floor, its beam flickering. The symbols on the walls burned brighter, the voice growing louder, more insistent. She woke up in her bed, drenched in sweat, her throat raw. Her friends were gone. The house was gone. But the symbols were still there, etched into the walls of her room, glowing faintly in the dark. And the voice, it was still whispering.
The town of Black Hollow was a place forgotten by time, nestled deep within a forest so dense that sunlight barely touched the ground. The locals spoke of it in hushed tones, calling it a thin place, where the veil between the living and the dead was at its weakest. But for 23-year-old journalist Clara Hayes, it was the perfect subject for her next exposé. She'd built her career on debunking the supernatural, and Black Hollow's legends were ripe for dismantling. The drive into town was eerie, the trees pressing in on either side of the narrow road. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic, like blood. Clara parked her car outside the town's only inn, a crumbling building with a sign that read, "The Hollow's Rest." The innkeeper, an elderly woman with hollow eyes, handed her a key without a word. Room 13, at the end of the hall. That night, Clara sat at the small desk in her room, reviewing her notes. The town's most infamous legend was the Hollow Man, a spectral figure said to appear at the edge of the forest, beckoning people to follow him into the trees. Those who did were never seen again. Clara scoffed. It was just another ghost story, born of isolation and superstition. But, as the hours passed, the room grew colder. The lamp on the desk flickered, casting long shadows on the walls. Clara heard a sound, a faint tapping, like fingers against glass. She turned to the window, her breath catching in her throat. There, standing in the moonlight, was a figure. Tall and gaunt, its face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat, its coat tattered and stained. It raised a hand, beckoning her to follow. Clara's heart raced, but she refused to believe what she was seeing. She grabbed her camera and rushed outside, determined to capture proof that it was just a prank. The figure was gone, but the forest loomed ahead, its trees twisted and gnarled, She hesitated, then stepped into the woods, the cameras strapped tight around her neck. The deeper she went, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees grew closer together, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the moonlight couldn't penetrate. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the metallic smell grew stronger. Clara's flashlight flickered, its beam growing weaker with each step. She heard whispers, faint and indistinct, coming from all around her. Then she saw it, a clearing bathed in an unnatural light. In the center stood the Hollow Man, his back to her. Clara raised her camera, her hands trembling as she snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the clearing, and for a split second, she saw them. Dozens of figures, their faces twisted in agony, their bodies suspended in the air like marionettes. The Hollow Man turned, his face a blank, featureless void, and reached for her. Clara ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps, the forest closing in around her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were a deafening roar. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the camera slipping from her grasp. The Hollow Man loomed over her, his hand closing around her wrist. His touch was ice-cold, his grip unbreakable. When Clara woke, she was back in her room at the inn. The camera was on the desk, its screen cracked. She scrolled through the photos, her stomach churning. The last one was of the clearing, the figures suspended in the air, their faces frozen in silent screams. And there, in the corner of the frame, was the Hollow Man, his featureless face turned toward the lens. Clara packed her things and left Black Hollow that morning, vowing never to return. But the whispers followed her, faint at first, then growing louder with each passing day. The photos she took that night vanished, leaving only blank frames. And sometimes, in the corner of her eye, she would see him. The Hollow Man, standing in the shadows, his hand outstretched, waiting for her to follow. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, the result of stress and exhaustion. But deep down, she knew the truth. The veil had been thin in Black Hollow, and she had crossed it. The Hollow Man wasn't just a legend. He was real, and he wasn't done with her yet.